Hello again. Here we are in the third part to our NPC tutorials. Today we're going to do a bit of scripting. Let's go over to blueprints. Let's open up NPCs and let's open up NPC base. Drag that tab to the top. So our interaction here, we've named this event dialogue. We're probably going to rename it to interact, just because that's a little more accurate for what we're doing. This NPC might not necessarily just give us dialogue. So we'll compile that and let's go and see that over in the NPC interaction, that's changed. It has. It's changed this event to interact. So we'll keep this print string here for now, but we're going to start adding some variables regarding dialogue. So let's start with a Boolean, and that Boolean is going to be called in conversation, because we're going to use the same button to progress our conversation and also to start the conversation. So we need to check if we're already in that conversation. So let's drag out a getter and a branch. We're also going to set in conversation if we're not already in that conversation. Let's get a not out of the getter. Plug the print string into the branch. So if we're not in conversation, then we're going to get in conversation. And then we have two things we'll want to do, one out of false and one out of true. We're going to need to create two custom events. The first will be progress dialogue. And the second will be another custom event, refresh dialogue. So if we're in a conversation already, then we'll be progressing that dialogue. So we can drag out a false and type in progress, and that's where the progress dialogue event will fire. So basically, we're already interacting with the NPC, and that's just going to the next line of dialogue. But if we're starting the conversation, then we're going to refresh dialogue. So let's drag out of in conversation, type in refresh. So that's the first interaction, figuring out whether we're already in the conversation or whether we're just starting it. We're going to start with refresh dialogue because that's the first thing that's going to happen. We can't progress dialogue without having dialogue. So to do this, we're going to be referring to the data table that we created in the last episode, which is under data d_dialogue, which introduces us to some new nodes. So let's get data table row names. This guy right here. Plug that into refresh dialogue. Click the drop down and select dialogue. Now you can see this is an array. So next up, let's hold F and get ourselves a for each loop. Plug in the for each loop executable and the array into the array. And then out of array element, we want to get data table row. And this will need to select our dialogue again. So basically what we're doing is grabbing our dialogue spreadsheet and we are going through it one by one. With those three nodes hooked up there, we can drag out of out row and break S dialogue, and we can get anything we want out of the structure for that row. So we're going to skip over name just for now. Remember how I said every NPC would have an index? Well, that's the next variable we're going to set up. Click plus on the variables. We're going to call this NPC index. And I'm going to put an underscore there. And that's going to be an integer, the same as our index here. So we're going to drag out of NPC index. And we're going to check, firstly, when we're going down the list, whether the index is equal to the NPC. So we'll set the number 1 here. And then this table will only get everything that's from NPC index 1. So we will first check that that is equal, drag out of row found into the branch. That's step 1. Step 2 is conversation index. Dragging that out, we want to make sure that the conversation that we're about to have is the right one. And so this is how we differentiate that. 2 equal signs. We check that the conversation is as it's been set. And we'll get a branch for that. So if the NPC index is true, and if it's the right piece of the conversation that we need, then we can add to our dialogue, which brings us to the next variable. click on variables, type in dialog actual. We're going to change the variable type to text, the same as our struct. But then we don't just want one line of dialogue. We want every line of dialogue that's in this conversation. So click on this little spot here, and this is where we can change it to a single item, a single variable, or an array. So now this is a list that we can read and add to. Let's drag out of dialog actual, drag out of that array, and type in add. And then true, once we know it's the right NPC and the right conversation, we will add that dialogue. And that dialogue is going to come from this guy right over here. So we'll grab a rewritable, do a bit of cleanup. And because we're not using line or name at this point, we can hide unconnected pins. So there's the cleaned up product. So basically that's what our refresh dialog script looks like, which means that every time we change our conversation, we're going to add all the lines of that dialogue into this array and then access that array later. So that script is done. We can't do progress dialog until we've done the next step here. So basically the long and short of it is we're going to fade the camera out, add a widget, which is going to be the HUD for our conversation, and then display the dialogue on that. So the next step naturally is to set up that widget. Compile and save this. Let's go over to the test map, down to user interface, right click, user interface, widget blueprint, utility underscore dialog. And we'll open that up. So the first thing I'd like to do, and this is going to be up to you how you want to do the layout as it normally is. I want to put a border on this canvas panel. I'm going to set my border to anchor to the bottom center. Zero that out. Change alignment to 0.5 so that it's properly centered. I'm going to give it a default size. So let's go 1280. Give 360 a go for the size on the y-axis. And then I'm going to drag up the y position. Maybe about there, maybe minus 240. I definitely don't want that glaring white there. So under brush color, I'm going to zero out RGB. And I'm going to set the alpha to 0.5. Next up, let's get a vertical box so we can arrange all of our elements correctly attached to the border. And in that vertical box, we will add 3 lines of text. Grab all 3 of them and let's center them up because they're all going to be centered. Grab the middle one and let's hit fill on that. So the top is going to be where we put the NPC's name. So we'll type in name here as a placeholder. The middle is going to be the dialogue. And the bottom is going to be the continue button. And we're going to come back here and set up a rich text block so that the input matches whatever we're using, whether it be keyboard and mouse, PlayStation or Xbox controller. But for now, we're just going to leave that as continue. Next up, let's attach these to some variables. Let's come over to the graph and under variables, let's hit the drop down. The first one will be name, and we will change that to a text variable. And then one more, we'll call this dialogue, and then back over to the designer. And if we compile that, select the name text block, we can hit this drop down and we can select name there. And if we hit the dialogue and hit the drop down, we can select dialogue. So this text block is binded to the name variable and this text block is binded to the dialogue variable, and we don't need to bind this one here just now. So now with that compiled and saved, we can go back over to NPC base. And once we have our dialogue saved here, we can now create the script to bring that up on screen. It won't be in order. I just want to get the elements in place, and then we're going to talk about how they work together, probably in a later episode if we're out of time. Right click, create widget, attach player controller to player controller. And the drop-down class will be utility underscore dialogue. Now we're going to want to talk to this as well later on after we've added it. So let's right click and promote that to a variable. That's going to be dialogue widget. And then once that's done, we can do add to viewport. Now, realistically, the best way to do this, rather than just throwing it up, is going to be between camera fades. So let's set that up as well. Let's get player camera manager, drag out of that and type in fade, start camera fade. We're going to need 2 of these. So copy that over and paste another one at the end. The first one is going to go from an alpha of 0 to an alpha of 1, and the duration is going to be 1 second. So 2 seconds in total to get dialogue happening, 1 to fade in, 1 to fade out. And here it would be the opposite, alpha 1 to alpha 0 with the duration there. We want to hold these once they're finished. But remembering that the script's going to fire off immediately, we need to put a delay between here. So let's grab a delay and make sure that delay is equal to the same time as the camera fade if you wanted a longer or a shorter camera fade. I'd recommend setting this up first and then tweaking later just to make sure it's all working. Another little thing that I'd recommend doing, getting our player controller again. And once we've decided that we're going to have a conversation, let's briefly disable input. So to do this, we're going to attach player controller to both of these nodes. Grab that player controller and over here. So while we're setting up the player, we're going to move the player in front of the NPC when that fade happens. We'll do that in a future episode. So then once that's done, we'll enable input again. And again, that will just take that 1 second to do the fade in and out. So making a little more room for that. And I will get another delay. So it's important to understand how long the player won't be able to be in control of their character. Sorry, 1 second there. So this will be a total of 2 seconds just to get it in the right position. Because when we teleport the player in front of the NPC, we don't want them moving around. We want to just be able to put them in the right position. And the way I've actually set this up in my own project is that you can walk away from the conversation. So it won't be just you progress through the conversation and that's it. We'll just move progress dialogue out of the way there. All of this is going to happen as soon as we've gotten our dialogue together. So at the end of completed, that's what's going to happen. One more thing in case you did want to test this out, even though we're nowhere near testing it out realistically, we're going to need to expose our NPC index, because now if I compile and save that and go and look at this guy in the world, I can drag him in and assign an index to him, meaning that I could hypothetically give him any conversation in the dialogue system that I wanted, which makes it easier for setting up all of those side quests. So I think that'll do for this episode. Plenty more foundational things to set up. In the next episode, hopefully we will be starting this conversation if we can get through the last little bits we need just to tie this up. So I will see you in that episode.